The look on my father's face when the notary slid that document across the table. I've replayed it maybe 1,000 times since. Not out of cruelty. Just because for 31 years I had never once seen him look small. That day he looked very small, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I grew up in a house that smelled like wood polish and unspoken rules. My father built his contracting business from nothing. That was the family story, the one we told at every Christmas dinner in Barrie, the one that got better every year until it sounded almost mythological. He was self-made. He was untouchable. And the most important thing you needed to understand about him, if you wanted to understand anything about my childhood, was that he did not consider women to be serious people. Not in a loud way. He never yelled it. He just operated on that assumption the way you operate on the assumption that the floor will hold you, so naturally, so completely, that he never once questioned it. My mother died when I was 9. After that, it was just the three of us, my father, my older brother, and me. My brother was being groomed for the business before he could legally drive. I was expected to be pleasant, presentable, and eventually married off to someone appropriate who would take the responsibility of me off my father's hands. I was not pleasant. I was not particularly presentable, and I had absolutely no interest in making myself easier for my father to manage. What I was, from about the age of 14, was interested in money, not in spending it, in understanding it, how it moved, where it went, why some families kept it and others didn't. I read everything I could get from the library. I took a business elective in high school that my father called a waste of a semester. I applied to the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto and got in on a partial scholarship, and my father's response was to ask who was going to pay for the rest of it. I was. That was the answer. I worked 3 jobs in first year. I graduated with honors. He came to the convocation. He took one photo. He said, "Don't forget you still need to find a husband." My brother, who had dropped out of college after 2 semesters and gone straight into the family business, stood next to him, already in his mid-20s, already acting like a mini version of every quality in my father that I found hardest to stomach. I moved to Toronto permanently after graduation. I got a job at a mid-size financial advisory firm in the financial district. I was good at it. Within 4 years, I had moved up enough that I was managing portfolios for clients who had more money than my father had ever seen in his life, and I did it quietly, without fanfare, because that was how I was trained, and because I genuinely didn't need my father's approval anymore. Or so I told myself. The truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that every time I did something I was proud of, there was still a small, embarrassing part of me that wanted to pick up the phone and tell him. That part never fully went away. I just got better at ignoring it. My father called me out of nowhere on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. I was between client meetings, standing at my office window watching the first real snow of the season blur the CN Tower into something almost soft-looking. My phone buzzed, his name on the screen. We spoke maybe 4 times a year. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Your grandmother left you something," he said, before I'd even finished saying hello. My grandmother, his mother, Nana Alderton, a woman who had lived in the same house in Owen Sound for 60 years and who I had quietly adored my entire life, had passed away in September. I'd driven up for the funeral. My father and I had stood on opposite sides of the reception and exchanged maybe 12 words. "What did she leave me?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough that I moved away from the window. "The property on Bayfield Street," he said. "But there are some complications." I knew the Bayfield Street property. It was a commercial building, 3 storefronts, 2 of them leased, 1 vacant. Nana had owned it since the 1980s. My father had been managing it for her for the past decade, collecting rents, handling maintenance. I'd assumed he'd inherit it outright. "What kind of complications?" I asked. "There's a dispute," he said. "Come up for the weekend, we'll talk." I went. I don't know why I went exactly. Some combination of genuine curiosity about the estate and that old stupid reflex of wanting to be in the room when my father was making decisions about things that concerned me. The kitchen in that Barrie house still had the same wallpaper from when I was 12. My father sat at the head of the table. My brother sat to his right, which told me immediately what kind of meeting this was going to be. My father's lawyer, a man named Howard, who had apparently been handling Alderton family business for 20 years, sat across from me with a folder I was not initially invited to look at. My father explained it the way he explained everything, slowly, with the built-in assumption that I would need several passes to understand. Nana had updated her will 18 months before she died. The Bayfield Street property, which had always been understood within the family to be my father's inheritance, had been redirected in that new will, to me. She wasn't thinking clearly, my father said. She was 81, she was on 3 different medications. Howard is going to help us have the will contested. I looked at Howard. Howard looked at his folder. On what grounds? I asked. Diminished capacity, my father said. Was she assessed? I asked. Did anyone document concerns about her mental state? Silence. Because I visited her in March, I said. She beat me at Scrabble twice and corrected my grammar at dinner. She seemed completely fine to me. My brother made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. My father's expression did not change. This is a family matter, my father said. The property belongs with the business. It always has. Your grandmother made an error and we're going to correct it. She didn't make an error, I said. She made a decision. That was the moment the conversation stopped being a conversation. My father told me I was being naive. He told me I didn't understand how estate law worked. He told me, and I want to be precise about this because I remember every word, that I had always had a difficult time accepting how things are done. I drove back to Toronto that Sunday night and called a lawyer on Monday morning. The estate litigation process in Ontario is not fast, it is not cheap, and it is not, in any meaningful sense of the word, fun. What it is a very effective filter for figuring out how serious someone is. My father, it turned out, was very serious. He retained Howard to file a formal challenge to the will on the basis of undue influence, the argument being that I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into changing her bequest in my favor. This was, to be absolutely clear, not true. I had not known about the change until my father told me. Nana and I were close, but our relationship consisted of Sunday afternoon phone calls, occasional visits, and a shared interest in terrible reality television. I had not been lobbying her for real estate. What I had done, and what I only found out later, when her personal papers were reviewed, was be the grandchild who called, regularly, reliably, who showed up, who asked her questions and actually listened to the answers, who had driven 4 hours round trip 3 times in the last year of her life just to sit with her in her garden and drink tea and let her talk about my grandfather and the early years and everything she'd built. My father had visited her twice in the last 2 years of her life, my brother once. The litigation moved slowly through the fall and into the winter. My lawyer, a woman in her 40s with the energy of someone who had been underestimated her entire career and had decided to make every person who'd done it regret it, walked me through every stage with complete clarity. She told me what to expect, and she told me when to be patient, and she told me at one point in January that the other side was going to try to make this personal. She was right. In February, my father's legal team filed a supplementary document that I can only describe as a greatest hits collection of every moment in my adult life when I had failed to meet my father's expectations. There was a reference to a period of financial difficulty I had gone through in my late 20s, a single year when I had carried more credit card debt than I should have, which I had paid off entirely, and which had left 0 lasting mark on my credit history. There was a reference to a relationship I had ended at 30 that my father had apparently decided was relevant to the question of whether I could be trusted to own a commercial building. There were references to estrangement from the family unit and a pattern of self-interested decision-making. I read it at my kitchen table in my apartment in Leslieville at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and I sat very still for a long time. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and sent my lawyer a list of every document I could think of that demonstrated my professional track record, my financial stability, and my character. I did not cry. I was not going to cry about this. The pretrial conference was scheduled for April. It was not a full trial. In most Ontario estate disputes, the parties go through a dispute resolution process first, and this was essentially the moment where both sides would put their positions on the table with a judge present. Not a verdict, but a reckoning. I took the day off work. I wore the suit I'd bought when I made senior associate. I met my lawyer in the lobby of the courthouse in Barrie, the city where I'd grown up, where my father still lived, where everyone in the room except my lawyer had some version of a shared history, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was calm. Not numb, calm. There is a difference. My father arrived with Howard and a second lawyer I hadn't seen before. They sat down on the other side of the room, and my father looked at me the way he always had, assessing, dismissing, and then he looked away, like I was something he was having to deal with. An inconvenience in a good suit. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and absolutely no patience for anything that wasn't directly relevant to the matter at hand. She went through the filings. She asked clarifying questions. She paused at the supplementary document, the one with my credit card debt and my ended relationship, and looked up over her glasses. "Counsel," she said to my father's lawyer, "I'm going to need you to help me understand the relevance of these personal details to the question of testamentary capacity." My father's lawyer began explaining. The judge listened. She did not look convinced. Then it was my lawyer's turn. She presented the timeline of my grandmother's will changes alongside the documented record of her medical assessments, including a cognitive evaluation done 8 months before her death, ordered by her own GP, which had found no impairment. She presented Nana's personal correspondence, including a letter written to her own solicitor explaining her reasons for the change. She presented, quietly and without drama, the visitation records that showed who had actually shown up. My father across the room was very still. The letter was the part that undid him. I hadn't known it existed until my lawyer found it. Nana had written it in her own handwriting, her careful looping script that I remembered from birthday cards. And it said, simply and directly, that she was leaving the Bayfield Street property to me because she trusted me to steward it well, because I had shown her what kind of person I was, and because she believed I had earned something solid to stand on. She used that phrase, something solid to stand on. The judge asked my father's legal team if they intended to continue challenging the documentation of mental capacity. There was a conference between my father and his lawyers. I watched it from across the room. I watched my father's face during that conference, and I want to be honest about what I saw, because I am not interested in performing satisfaction I didn't feel. What I saw was not collapse. It was something more complicated. A man who had spent his entire life operating on one set of assumptions encountering, for the first time in a very public setting, evidence that those assumptions had cost him something. He settled. That afternoon. The challenge to the will was withdrawn. My lawyer shook my hand in the lobby after. She said, "Your grandmother knew what she was doing." I said I knew, I'd always known. My father passed me in the lobby on his way out. My brother was ahead of him, already through the door. My father slowed. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything. But he looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that I'd spent 31 years waiting for, and that, now that it had finally arrived, felt almost beside the point. I drove back to Toronto. I stopped for coffee in Bradford because I needed 20 minutes to just sit in a parking lot and feel whatever I was actually feeling, which turned out to be something complicated and not entirely triumphant. I had won. The property was mine. Nana had been right, and my father had been wrong, and the court had confirmed it in the most official way possible. But I also thought about my father eating dinner alone in that Barrie house with the 12-year-old wallpaper, and my brother who was going to spend his whole career defined by being his father's son, and I thought about all the years I had spent shrinking myself down to fit into a room that was never going to have enough space for me anyway. I didn't call him. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be, that's honest. I took possession of the Bayfield Street property in June. The two existing tenants, a hair salon that had been there for 11 years and an insurance broker who renewed every 2 years like clockwork, were both lovely. The vacant storefront I leased to a woman who was opening a physiotherapy clinic after she sent me the most thorough business plan I had ever seen from a first-time commercial tenant. She reminded me, a little, of myself. I hired a property manager. I set up a proper management structure. I did everything right. On the first day I held the keys, I went to the building before the property manager arrived, and I stood on the sidewalk on Bayfield Street in Owen Sound in the early morning, and I looked at it for a long time. 3 storefronts. Red brick. A building my grandmother had bought in 1987 for reasons that probably made sense to her in ways she never fully explained to anyone. Something solid to stand on. I thought about calling someone. My best friend in Toronto, maybe, or my cousin out in Calgary who had always been quietly in my corner. I thought about taking a photo for social media, but that felt wrong, too neat, too performed. Instead, I just put the keys in my pocket and went to get breakfast at a diner around the corner, and I ate scrambled eggs and read the Owen Sound Sun-Times, and a woman at the next table asked me if I was from around here, and I said I used to be, and she said, "Wasn't that always the way?" And I said yes. I suppose it was. I drove home to Toronto that afternoon with the windows down and the radio loud. For the first time in a very long time, I felt exactly as large as I actually was.